各位朋友，晚上好，我是今晚的主持人郭晨，欢迎来到上图坊创谈会云聊吧。今天晚上的对话将来自英国皇家摄影学会的分享，主题是向无界，邀请英国皇家摄影学会高层以及历届英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展的获奖者，给我们揭秘连续举办了163届的英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展的神秘面纱，探寻获奖作品背后的故事，并给到屏幕前的听众在创作及理念上的收获。今天邀请到的嘉宾为英国皇家摄影学会的项目总监迈克尔·普理查德博士，美国摄影艺术家阿尔杰·克恩，美国视觉艺术家莱斯利·谢利尔，英国青年摄影艺术家欧文·哈维。让我们一起期待他们将会带给我们怎样的惊喜。下面有请各位嘉宾。Hi, welcome. 在开始本期对话前，我先给大家介绍一下今天的翻译 Jenny。今晚的对话呢，将由她全程负责翻译。欢迎 Jenny。
So hi everyone, I will be translating for you guys tonight. Okay.
OK。今天晚上的对话呢，和以往不同的是，本期的上图网创谈会呢，由英国皇家摄影学会联合举办。今年呢，正值是中国和英国建交50周年，所以能够在这样特殊的年份和英国皇家摄影学会做这样的一个合作对话，也是意义非凡。今天我们很荣幸的邀请到英国皇家摄影学会前理事长、项目总监迈克尔·普理查德博士。迈克尔曾经在佳士得拍卖行担任摄影专家，策划国际性的拍卖会。他拥有摄影史的博士学位，担任了许多国际摄影大赛的评委。也包括大家都熟悉的迪拜哈姆丹摄影奖、年度旅行摄影师、年度最佳美食摄影师大赛、国际摄影奖 IPA 和露西奖等等。他还曾经呢，在包括中国北京国际摄影周在内的各个摄影节和展览中，担任策展人。在2015年的时候呢，我和Michael 一起在北京国际摄影周，策展了英国皇家摄影学会1839到1930年典藏摄影作品展，也是广受好评。Michael，首先呢，你能否给大家简单的介绍一下英国皇家摄影学会？
Okay, so ni hao and welcome everyone. I've been asked to talk a little bit about the history of the RPS and the International Photography Exhibition. So the RPS, the Royal Photographic Society, is the world's oldest photography organization. It dates back to 1853. And its membership has included many of the greatest photographers. And from the 19th century, we have Julia Margaret Cameron here on the left, and Roger Fenton shown here, who was the Society's first secretary and arguably the world's first war photographer. So the RPS publishes the world's longest running journal of photography, which again goes back to 1853. And it also publishes a scientific journal looking at the science and technology of photography. And its other significant activity through much of its history was to form an important collection of photographs, cameras, and a library. And that's now housed in London at the Victoria and Albert Museum. So today, the RPS is in this wonderful building in Bristol, which is about an hour from London. And we have an auditorium where we do talks and screenings and conferences. We host workshops and meetings, and we have a resource room which has a library and historic photography, as well as our exhibition space. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the IPE history now, just for a few minutes. So the International Photography Exhibition, which is what we're all here tonight for, is the world's oldest photography exhibition. It dates back to 1854, which is what's seen in this picture. And that very first exhibition was attended by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, who also purchased some of the photographs within the exhibition. So the exhibition showed artistic photography, but it also showed scientific photography, which reflected the two sides of the RPS. And these pictures will just show you a few historic examples of some of the work that was included. I think the important thing is that the exhibition, over its history of we're now at the 164th edition, has always reflected what's happening more widely within photography. And for me, that's one of the reasons why the IPE remains an important exhibition, because it has the continuity from the 19th century right up to today. And today it's a very forward-looking contemporary exhibition of some of the best photography in the world. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the International Photography Exhibition 163. So it's the 163rd edition of the exhibition. We opened this exhibition just a few weeks ago, and it's in the gallery at the RPS in Bristol. And the exhibition includes some well-known names, but also people who are producing wonderful photographs documenting the world today. So the exhibition tours around the UK as well. So it opens at the RPS and then tours through the UK, and sometimes it tours overseas as well. So I'm going to talk now just for a few minutes about some of the practical sides of the exhibition, how it's selected and why the exhibition is important. So for me, one of the important features of the exhibition is that the selectors, the people that choose the photographs, come from across photography. They represent artists and photographers. They come from curators, publishers, and people working with photography. So they bring a lot of experience and expertise to their selections. So one of the things that makes the IPE distinctive is that we take initially just digital uploads from entrants, and then we make the final selection from the photographer's own prints that they've either had specially made for the selection or we've had made for them. So the selection is done from the actual prints that will be in the exhibition. So as an example, so the 163rd edition, the selectors were Monica Alcazar Duarte, who's a Mexican-British photographer working in the UK. Seba Chowdhury, who's a curator and creative producer that has worked on festivals and projects internationally. Tim Clark, who was invited to be a selector, and he edits 1,000 Words, which is an online magazine, which I would encourage you to have a look at. Okay. Joy Gregory, who's one of the RPS's honorary fellows and has been a photographic artist since the 1980s, producing interesting and very distinctive work. And then myself, but you know who I am, so we can move on. So again, as an example, I thought I would just use the 163 to show you that we had nearly 4,000 images entered for the exhibition. So those were all digital. From that, we shortlisted 580 images, and then they were printed, and then the final selection of 105 images that appear in the exhibition are from the prints that were then reviewed by the selectors, and they are the prints that were chosen to be shown. And I think one of the interesting things about the exhibition over the recent years, over the last maybe 3, 4, 5 years, is that there's been an increasing number of series work included in the exhibition. So although we have 105 images in the exhibition, that represents 57 individual photographers. Okay. So the exhibition opens in Bristol. It will then travel around the UK, and then we'll be on tour for about 1 year. And then we're on to the next exhibition and cycle of the IPE. So I showed you some of the historical catalogues from the exhibition earlier. This year, we've become very contemporary. We've produced a zine of the exhibition, which shows an image from each of the represented photographers. So just to talk a little bit about why the IP is important. I think for our audience in China, I think it's something that's very distinctive because it's very different to the salons organized by FIAP and the PSA, for example, which are very good. But the IPE has that history behind it, which is important. And it also, for the photographer, it's not so much about earning points for the FIAP tables, but it's about showing the best of photography, contemporary photography, and the stories that are being shown through the photographs. So it's an international call that goes out, and I would say that we get very good entries from China, especially, and I pay credit here to Gojing and the Shangtuf Art Club for the work that they do in supporting the IPE, and also, you know, their members do get a lot of shortlist, you know, are often shortlisted and selected. So thank you, Gojing, for that. But it also attracts large numbers. And for the photographer, it raises their profile, which is very important these days, especially for those hoping to make a career. And for the public, the visitors that see the exhibition or see some of those selected works on social media or in the press, then it tells really important stories about the world that we all live in and the people within it. And that's really what, for me, photography is very good about doing. So just finally, for this section, just to talk a little bit about the IPE 164. The 164 is at the moment is open for entries, so the open call is on at the moment. I think for our audience here, it's important to say that entry is open to everyone. It's an open call. We don't categorize work, so you can submit any of your work, and we accept both single images or series of work, up to 4 images that can tell, you know, bigger stories about the world and about using photography. So for a single entry, it's free to enter, and then we have a standard entry fee which covers the cost of the exhibition. The RPS doesn't make money from the exhibition, and through the work of Shangtuf and Gojing, then there's a discounted entry for our entrants from China. So these are just some of the key dates. So the call opened in February. It closes on the 17th of May. And then we will do the selection. So we will do the shortlisting in July and August. The final selection for the exhibition is made at the end of August. And then we're open the exhibition at the RPS in January of 2023. This is the URL, which can be shared through the chat for anyone that wants more information. And then I just thought I would conclude by just showing you some highlights from the shortlist of the 163. And you can see more of these again on the links here. But I think it will show the breadth of the type of photography because it is an open call. It covers everything from portraiture through to documentary and environmental photography. So just remember that you may just be looking at one image from a series that tell a bigger story. And we do very much encourage work from outside of Europe, because I think that's often underrepresented in international exhibitions. So we very much encourage work from Africa and Asia. So this is a piece of work from Liz Hingley, who's a British photographer. She was documenting COVID and the lockdown that we had here over 2020 to 2022. And this is one of the portraits that she made during that period of a lawyer who was having to work from home, but still had to dress in his lawyer's robes. And as unsurprisingly, we have seen a lot of COVID work, but it needs to be quite distinctive to stand out. So the exhibition will also include documentary work like this, landscape and environmental work. Again, this is part of a bigger series of work. Again, we've seen a lot of drone photography in the last 3 or 4 years as well, but the best of it is wonderful, but it can be overdone. And a lot of the IPE often includes portraits because they're often telling very human stories about the world in which we live. And then it also includes more pure art photography. So this is the work of an American photographer that produces these absolutely beautiful photographs that are then have work on top of them and behind them with gold leaf and other techniques. A lady called Wendy, and these are absolutely beautiful prints, and we'll hear about some of the more using the artistic side of photography, I think, later. And then just finally, the last two I'm going to show, again, these are parts of bigger series of work, but this is from a Korean photographer who's under 30, and he's produced a body of work that looks at his relationship with his father. And we make special awards to the under 30-year-old photographers, and to a general award for the best, as we see it, picture or series of work in the exhibition. So this won the under 30s, and then this series of work won the overall winner. It's from a French photographer called Tim Franco, who's made a series of portraits using obsolete Polaroid materials of North Korean defectors, and he tells their stories of how they came to left North Korea and moved to the South. So for those of you that might be thinking about entering the IPE or has seen work on just some of these examples that you think actually my work is as good or better than that, then I suppose the advice I would give you is to make sure that your work is distinctive and not something that the selectors will have seen before. And do think about the human stories that you can show using your photography, or stories about the environment or the world in which you live, which will be important for the selectors, or be of interest to the selectors. So if you can ideally bring your own style of your photography and make that prominent, because that will make it distinctive. We do see a lot of subjects that appear year after year, but the selectors are often less interested in beautiful landscapes or sunsets, and are more interested in some of the stories, the human interest stories being told through photography. And as I mentioned earlier, the work from China is frequently shortlisted, and some of it will end up in the final selection. There's a lot of really creative, distinctive work being done in China, and important stories being told through photography from Chinese photographers, particularly from younger Chinese photographers. And then what we can provide is exhibiting your work and exposing it to the wider world, the Western world especially, and ensuring that the stories that you tell through your photography are given wider exposure. And in the future, we're also looking to work with these selected photographers to help them with areas like print sales, and helping them commercialize their work, or making introductions to people commissioning photographers. A number of the people that have been selected in the IPE in the past have gone on to establish careers within photography, and obviously a number already have good strong careers in photography. So we're always keen to support them and help them where we can. So just to summarize, be creative, produce something distinctive, and try and find subjects that aren't seen particularly in the West. Okay, thank you. And my contact details, if anyone wants to reach me directly, you can see those on the presentation, or I'm happy for them to be shared more widely. Thank you.
Thank you. 谢谢 Michael 的精彩分享。通过他刚才的介绍呢，我们不仅对英国皇家摄影学会 以及英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展的历史及发展有了一个更清晰的一个脉络和了解。同时呢，我们对英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展的这个评审和展览也进一步了解。通过 Michael 在刚才展示的这些获奖作品中呢，我们可以看到，英国皇家摄影学会在他们在选这些作品的时候，他们是喜欢那种有创意的、有故事性的、有独特的视角的、有它鲜明的个性的。所以呢，它对于我们今年，比如中国摄影师想要参加这个大展。给到如何取得一个好成绩，如何能够参与到这个大展，指明了一个方向，也给我们提出了一个很好的建议。所以再次感谢 Michael 的精彩分享。
Thank you, Jenny too as well.
今天呢，我们还很荣幸的邀请到了3位在历届英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展中的获奖作者来分享他们的获奖作品。首先，第一位出场的是来自美国的摄影艺术家 RJ 科恩，他的作品未被选中的，在2017年第160届英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展中获得银奖，之后在163届再次入围。而这个系列的作品呢，也分别在美国格里芬摄影博物馆、平原艺术博物馆、格鲁吉亚现代艺术博物馆、英国伦敦国家肖像画廊和中国一线国际摄影节等地展出，被国家地理杂志等刊登，并被明尼阿波利斯艺术学院和休斯顿美术博物馆收藏。下面我们通过一个短片，来了解 RJ 科恩以及他正在进行的这个创作项目。
I like to think like a painter, both in terms of the light I use, its interplay with shadow, and I think the most important thing is I'm looking for this humanity in the moment. The Unchosen Ones project took over 6 years to create. I drove 10,000 miles and photographed 65 youth. In 2016, I traveled to as many county fairs as I could that summer. I made it to 10. Then in 2020, I traveled to them and met them on their home pasture. Or what do you love best about Hootie?
I love that she has her own personality. She is her own little goat. She will do what she wants, when she wants, how she wants.
Is that kind of like you?
More or less.
How do I choose my subject and a location? I feel like sometimes like these kids chose me.
I've been in 4-H since I was 4 or 5.
My favorite things showing, definitely at the state fair. You put in so much work year-round for one day of showing.
When all your hard work comes back, it feels amazing. It feels like you won the lottery.
I use a medium format camera and studio lighting in the field, which is a very slow way of working. I like the mindfulness that comes with moving slow. People say never work with animals or kids. Yet, I did both. How did I put them at ease and make it happen? Patience and a sense of humor goes a really long way.
If you had to choose to spend more time with family or more time with your animals, which would you choose?
Animals.
Oh, okay. If you had a choice to spend more time with your friends versus your animals, which would you choose?
Definitely my animals.
Definitely your animals. Here's Annabelle, and I'll ask Annabelle a few questions. So Annabelle, what's your favorite food?
Probably grain.
Grain. All right. Does she have a favorite sound? What would that sound like?
Probably the sound of grain being
Okay.
poured.
Now you might ask yourself, why the great backdrop? Well, for one, place matters. This series did not take place in a studio, but rather the raw setting of a county fair environment or a home pasture. I feel like the studio backdrop serves as a compositional device to almost elevate the subject beyond the ordinary. I'm interested in this messiness of real life. There we go, so a little wider angle. Not a hyper curation of the ideal. When I met them, I promised to put them in the best light possible. Yet before I clicked that shutter for that first set of portraits, I asked all the kids one thing. I said, show me what next year's grand champion could look like. And almost instantaneously, I saw the kids' demeanor and their body language change. And it's those little moments are when I create a photograph. You know, living on a farm is a full-time commitment. It's not a petting zoo. It takes a lot of hard work. I just hope that county fairs will still be around in 100 years, and kids will still be learning valuable life lessons from raising and showing animals.
What's the favorite thing that you love about working with your animals?
That they're honestly my life.
谢谢二姐。下面我有个问题想问你一下，就是你能否首先给大家介绍一下这组作品的一个背景？
You bet. You bet. Well, Gojing, thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here with Michael and Leslie and Owen and all of you. So thank you. I will now share my screen, and I have a short presentation. I feel like a picture's worth 1,000 words. So the title of the project is called The Unchosen Ones, Portraits of an American Pastoral. I wanted to give a special thank you really quick to Gojing, National Geographic, my book publisher, Kara Verlag, and MW Editions, and the Minnesota State Arts Board. I met Gojing at 2017 Photo Lucida portfolio reviews, and we're very lucky to have them as photographers. They're a wonderful opportunity to get feedback on work in progress and develop relationships. So it was nice to meet Gojing again 2 years later, and she presented me my certificates and encouragement for my photography. Engaging new audiences in China is important to me. I would like to at least share what the work from the project looks like in the 160th IPE exhibition. And here you can see installation views from the old Truman Brewery in London. And I was very excited to be awarded a silver award, and I have it right here. They give you your name on a little coin. It's very special. The work has traveled around the world, including festival and photography exhibitions in China. And here again is Gojing. And this is what the work looks like in a museum art gallery environment. I hand make the cherry frames, the wood frames, and the reason is I want the prints to be exhibited like fragile, the nature of the emotions, like the youth were feeling at the time I photographed them. I published a book called The Unchosen Ones, which came out last December, and the work features diptychs, so 2 images side by side of the same youth, many with the same animals. And there's over 50 of these diptych portraits. So now I'd like to give you a quick overview of my projects, what led me to create this work. The Divine Animals, the Bovidae, was the name of my first project. This photograph was created in Ireland, which is where my mother's family is from. And I was interested in this domesticity of sheep and goats. According to National Geographic, humans have had relationship with these animals for a very long time, even before relationships with dogs and cats. And we've relied on them for milk, cheese, fiber, companionship. I'm inspired by European landscape painting in terms of composition and light. And here's one of my favorite painters, Thomas Sidney Cooper. And you can see the resemblance in terms of the warm colors, the cool colors, the composition with leading lines going to the eyes of the animal, and kind of in some of my own work. This is one of my favorite photographs called Attack of the Clones, which is a Star Wars reference, but also references the first animal, the mammal, to be cloned, which was Dolly the sheep. And here you can see some resemblance again to painters. I use a lot of lighting in the field to help point what exactly I find most important, and it creates and lends itself to a little bit of drama. So the Unchosen Ones project, I started in 2016, and I wanted to give you an overview of that and why I began that project. One of my favorite movies, Talladega Nights, there's a quote by one of the characters. His dad was a race car driver, and he put a lot of pressure on his son to be the winner, the best. And the son, he grew up thinking like if he wasn't first, he was last. And this placed a lot of pressure on them. And I feel like a lot of youth today feel very much the same. They have to be the winner. And another example is in the movie Cars. The very first sentence in the movie, the character says, "One winner, 42 losers. I eat losers for breakfast."
Okay.
So I took my camera to the state fair, which is an animal contest. They're very popular here in the United States, specifically in Minnesota. We have the largest in the world. And my camera, I did not know what to expect. And I met Jocelyn, and I was really drawn to this relationship between the youth and the animal, and they cared for the animal. And I wanted to elevate them. And just because they didn't receive the best ribbon, which would be the grand champion, I was interested in exploring the ones that did not win. Here's an example where you can see the painterly light as it relates to a painting and the pose. I did not pose the animals or the youth. I simply kind of directed them what to stand, where to stand, and of course the safety of the animals and the youth was very important. Drawing on the history of photography, we see some of the very first photographs are often of prize-winning animals, such as cattle and horses. And I'm inspired by Adrian Tournejean and Nadar, and they've done a lot in terms of photography and pioneering, like the electronic flash and this notion of portraiture as a commercial way of supporting oneself. Photography was born about the same time as animal contests, about 1850. I'm interested in people like August Sander, who was photographing in between the wars ordinary people, in this case, the bricklayer, as well as D.N. Arbus, where you can see this in my work.
所以呢，就是说你在你的这些作品中，你的这样的作品的风格的呈现是受到了很多的绘画作品，还有包括一些你的一些摄影师的一些作品对你的一个影响，然后造就了你现在的这样的一个风格。
Correct, yes. Although I did not invent the backdrop or the usage of leaving in the C-stands or other background peripheral, as I mentioned, I am interested in real, not hyper-curated, not perfection. And we see this in this portrait of Annie Leibovitz for Vanity Fair. And I do think it's important that Annie signed the photograph, even though this was commercial work, she embraces it as fine art.
Okay. 那么你是怎么样找到这些孩子，并且那个安排完成了这样的一个肖像的创作？比如说你在拍摄过程中有没有碰到什么困难？应该来说呢，我们就很难想象你这样的一组作品，这样的一组肖像作品是在即时中完成的。
Yeah, patience and a sense of humor is very important. You know, I would go up to them as they were being judged, and I would ask their permission and parents' permission. And it would only take a few minutes, 5 minutes, but I made sure to get their contact information. And then I would follow up with them and send them a book and that sort of thing. Yeah, did you have other questions or should I do presentation? I don't know how we're doing on time. I want to be sensitive. This was the equipment that I bring. I wanted to tell a quick story about this photograph. He received reserve champion, which is second place. And he was second out of 2. So he was last place. And that's important because these fairs are getting smaller and smaller. And I worry about where our food will come from, given global climate change and concerns for sustainability. And we've seen that with the pandemic, how food sourcing can be much more of a challenge than we imagine. I'm going to skip through a few more just to show you these were the same animals that I had met, but then I would continue to photograph them in their home pasture. And again, you can see the painterly references with the warm color and the shadows, in this case, the green. This was an outcome from Photo Lucida, where the work was published in National Geographic. And I create collector's editions, which help support the sales of the books as well as prints. This is at the Taylor Wissing exhibition in London and my gallery in Minnesota. This is what the exhibition looked like at the Griffin Museum of Photography and the Plains Art Museum, where I speak to 4th graders. At the Minneapolis airport, and the work has traveled to include, this is Brooklyn, New York, called The Fence. And I would recommend any photographers that opportunity, very much like the IPE. I thought it was important to bring the work back to where I created, and I built these displays and interviewed the youth, giving advice for their competitors and sharing life stories that they learned from working and raising animals. And then 4 years later, I was able to re-photograph them. So this was in 2020. And you can see the changes in the animals and the changes in the youth. But I was really interested in this sense of place. And so I began kind of pulling back and putting a wider lens on to get more of the pastoral scenery of where these youth live.
OK， 那个，而且在这边嘛，我想问一下，你刚刚展示的这些作品，你能不能结合这些作品给我们讲讲这些孩子的那个照片中的这些孩子，讲一下他们的一些故事。
In this case, Emma and Ethan no longer work with their animals. And Emma is into jazz ballet and Ethan is into forestry and track and field, and he's holding a shot put like they do in the Olympic Games. They move on. They're interested in other things. I also wonder, and that concerns me, about like the future of farming and what does that say about the future? We had a lot of kitties and chickens and photobomb while I was creating the work. I should also mention one of my favorite photographers is David Hearn, English, and he was very interested and still is in just life, just the normalcy of life and documenting that. Not interested necessarily in the exotic. And I often wonder, is my work important? And, you know, I've talked with war photographers and they say that you need both sides. If it's all gloom and doom, no one will listen to the news. They want to hear some uplifting, inspiring stories. And that's what I like to tell. Catherine went to school after showing animals and learned how to repair guns. And she's very passionate about firearms. And many of the kids are still working with the same animals. Of course, hockey takes a lot of the kids away from raising animals, and it's very popular in Minnesota. They have a stretching machine on the farm. It's a joke. And in some point, the unchosen ones is all of us. We all know what it's like not to be chosen for something in life, whether it be for love, for a job, for sports, or a photography exhibition. Yet resilience ultimately is what defines us.
其实我觉得你在这个创作这个系列的可贵之处，就是在最初的一组肖像你完成之后的，在4年后，你又重新审视这些被拍摄的对象，然后看看他们是如何成长变化的，并再次的去拍摄他们。以几乎完全相同的姿势，如果有可能的话是相同的动物在一起。然后在这个拍摄过程呢，它不仅仅是单纯的鼓励失败者，鼓励失败者激励他们这样的一个意义。我们在你的这个项目里面，其实看到了一个美国农村的一个未来的一个走向。因为我们可以从孩子们的这个变化中间间接的了解到美国农村正在发生什么变化。我想这个是你的这个项目的重要意义所在。
Yes, yes. And I wanted to share to help support the book project and ongoing studio practice. This is an example of the collector's edition that I've created that is different than the trade edition book, and it comes with the selection of any 2 photographs in the book, both of which are editions of 10. And I have an upcoming exhibition in May, and there's currently an exhibition in Spain, and that's it. Any other questions, or shall we move on?
Yeah, 我在想呢，你是当你开始一个新的项目的时候，你对图像有一个特定的美学要求，还是说它会随着作品拍摄而发展？
Sure. I had a vision of the quality of light I wanted to contribute, and I was open to kind of the moment that was created in front of the camera lens. I maintained a consistent approach throughout the project, bringing kind of the same studio backdrop and lighting and similar pose. And I'm proud to kind of illustrate some of these treatment of moments that are rarely dignified by the camera. I use nature as a device to understand a better sense of self, drawing upon like historical precedents, you know, the use of animals as a metaphor, and the pastoral tradition. My aesthetic, to answer the question, is, you know, emphasizes this clarity and projects kind of this stillness, almost a balm to an overstimulated society with phones and all of that, computers.
那我想你是通过这样的一个项目，用一种与众不同的方式发现并记录了美国乡村的这种竞技的一个传统，并创造了一个关于美国农村的一个视觉冥想。 那非常非常感谢 RJ 给我们分享的这些精美的作品，以及这些作品背后的一个故事。接下来呢，我想将这个接力棒再次传给 Michael。就是 Michael， 我有一个问题想问一下你。您在英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展中呢，担任多届的一个评委。那 RJ 的作品呢，他在第160届的时候获得了银奖，而在163届的时候呢，又再次的入围。所以我想您能否从评委的角度来给我们解读一下，为什么这个系列的作品会受到评委的青睐？
Well, I think firstly, it goes without saying that the quality of the work, in terms of the technical side and the approach that that RJ has taken to the portraiture, is second to none. It's very, very important. But what, beyond that though, I think we see a lot of portraiture entered into the IPE, but what I think lifts RJ's work, beyond the quality, is that, I think he used the term, the humanity in the moment in his presentation, that there's something more beyond the portraits, that takes it to a much higher level. And that's what separates, really good portraiture from, the best portraiture. There's something more beyond the work. And I think the selectors recognized that when they saw the work. And then one starts to read the stories behind it, and then you start to make your own connections as a selector to actually there's a bigger story here about agriculture, about changing societies, about young people growing up and changing and responding to the world. And suddenly all of that comes together to produce something that really is then head and shoulders above anything else that was entered into the exhibition. And then finally, it comes back to what I said during my presentation, that there's an approach to RJ's photography, a particular style, particular aesthetic, if you like, that again is very distinctive to his work. And again, that separates his work out from other types of portraiture that we saw at the selection process for that particular IPE. And again, it just lifts it above anything else. And that's why it got selected. And having just listened to RJ talking and seeing his presentation, even now, several years later, and seeing those before and after pictures, if you like, there's so much more depth there than I had realized first time around. And I think if RJ were to enter work into, say, the 165 or the 166 IPE, then again, I think, particularly those comparators between 2016 and 2020, then, again, I think it would stand a good chance of being selected, because it has everything there that one would like to think good portraiture is about, the individual portraits, of course, but that bigger story, or bigger stories in this case, that those pictures can be used to tell.
谢谢 Michael 的精彩点评。所以我想一个好的作品，它不仅要有技术的呈现，还要有你内在的这种力量，还要你有独特的一种个性。所以我想呢，Michael 的这些意见，还有包括那个 RJ 刚才的这些分享，对于屏幕前的听众朋友们呢，将会有很大的一个帮助。在请出第二位艺术家之前呢，我给大家提个醒，本期直播我们在最后设置了一个问答环节，如果你有什么问题想要和我们的嘉宾进行对话的，请将您的问题递交过来，届时工作人员将会抽取其中具有代表性的问题进行一个现场解答。接下来呢，我们将要请出的是来自美国的视觉艺术家莱斯利·谢利尔，他的作品《花卉的性教育》在162届英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展中入围。莱斯利的作品呢，旨在探索19世纪以男性为中心的社会中的女性身份，结合了复古的西版摄影。他对其进行扫描和后期处理，以创作以历史19世纪的图像为基础，同时融入个人经验和幻象的拼贴画。下面我们来看一下莱斯利的这组作品。下面我给大家播放一个短片。 非常棒的作品分享。从刚才展示的视频中呢，我们可以看到莱斯利的作品很有个性和想法，在作品的表现风格上也独具一格。另外我发现呢，这些作品都是在老照片的基础上再次的创作，所以我想问一下莱斯利，这些都是什么时期的老照片？你是怎么样找到这些作品的？
I'm going to share my screen now. So hopefully this will work. Well, my tintypes basically were invented in France by Adolphe Alexander Martin and were popular from 1856 to the 1870s. And what made tintypes so popular is that they could be made quickly and without a darkroom, and they were affordable. And this created an opportunity for the general public and not just the rich to have their images recorded. And here are some tintypes, and this is some of the ways that they were presented. I'm actually not sure because I can't hear your questions in English. If that would be really helpful if you can say it in English also. Okay, so yeah, at one point, tintypes are really affordable and they were easy to find. They would just be like a couple of dollars each, and I could get them in antique stores and flea markets and online. And basically you could still find tintypes easily, but they're much more expensive now.
那一般你会选择什么内容、什么类型的照片进行再创作呢？
Okay, in each series that I create, I try to tell a story about the lives of women during the 19th century. And what I look for depends on the series I'm creating. The subject's faces or surroundings need to convey an idea or an emotion that will go with the story I'm trying to tell. This is Frances on the left and Frances in my series titled Antidote on my right. I like to give names to my women. I do this to give each a personal identity, which is something that she did not have during the 19th century when women were considered property of their husbands.
就是说你选择这个时期的照片进行创作，你有没有什么一个特别的含义在？
Basically, I picked these images because because photography was new during the 19th century, and that I'm sorry, you just took me out of order, so just a little confused here. So I'm going to go
continue
back. Okay, good. I choose images from the 19th century because it was the beginning of the suffrage movement, as well as the invention of photography. And because photography was so new, these tintypes could have been the first time these women's images had ever been recorded. So these are original images from that period.
那么你怎么会想到创作这样的一组作品？你的创作灵感来源是在哪里呢？
Yeah, I do a lot of research about the history of these women, and I'd read a book about the English feminist Elizabeth Wolstenholme Elmy, who wrote a book titled Baby Buds. She created a botany primer for children that covertly doubled as a sex education handbook for children. And I'm not sure if I said the title, it's called Baby Buds. And she did this because in the 18th century, botanist Carl Linnaeus developed a system to categorize plants. He compared parts of plants to human sexual organs and used analogies comparing the reproduction of plants to human sexuality and love. And Elmy used that system and bypassed scrutiny by creating a story teaching youngsters about sex through flowers.
所以就是你在您的这个系列作品中呢，都是每一幅作品中都有不同的一个花卉，也就是从这样的一个灵感过来的。那就是在这里呢，花卉是代表了什么？你能不能结合一些具体的案例作品，比如说英国皇家摄影学会，你有3幅作品入围，你能不能具体来聊一下，给大家展示一下？
So botany was so popular during the 19th century that there were fads created around flowers. And one was called the language of flowers, also known as floriography. And these were 19th century books that assigned a symbolic meaning to each flower. And this way one could communicate with another without breaking any of the strict verbal Victorian taboos of the time by creating a bouquet of carefully chosen flowers to convey a message. So for example, this is Anita with pomegranate, and the pomegranate symbolizes fertility. So this is a before and after shot, or rather a after and before shot. Anyway, this image is titled Eula with hollyhocks. Hollyhocks represent fecundity. And this is Celia with apricot. Apricots symbolize love.
那你为什么会想到用这样的一个方法来进行创作？您在作品中想要表达什么样的一个情愫？
So what brings everything together is that photography was a 19th century invention, and botany was one of the few pastimes a woman was allowed to pursue during that same era. The Industrial Revolution created a new way of life as men began to work away from the home. And this created a strong delineation between the roles of men and women in society. Men and women lived in what was known as separate spheres, and women belonged at home as wives and mothers. And botany was one of the few opportunities open to women at the time. And it was considered a healthy outdoor pastime that allowed women to marvel at God's creation. Women were not allowed to study botany as a science, that it was considered a man's domain. And what I'm trying to convey is how much women's lives were restricted by the moral codes of the time.
那就是你能否和我们聊聊你当时是怎么样来进行创作的？
Yeah, I scan the tintypes and manipulate them using Photoshop. And then I have a website that I use to download vintage botanical illustrations that I digitally deconstruct. Then I add to or subtract from the images to create a digital collage. And I believe that each tintype tells a story created by the photographer and the sitter. And I take that story as my starting point to create a narrative about these women's lives, as said earlier, by incorporating history, symbolism, botany, and an infusion of fantasy, along with some of my personal experiences.
那就是您在创作过程有没有碰到什么困难？
Once I come up with a concept, I'm not sure if that I have many challenges other than trying to convey the message. There's certainly technical challenges along the way, but I usually solve them by watching YouTube tutorials. Basically, I look forward to creating my images. It's sort of, you know, I get excited when I start something new.
那您的这些作品在本质上是不是带有那种女权主义的那个色彩？
Definitely. I don't see how you can be a woman and not be a feminist. My work is all about exploring female identity in a male-centric society. And my images focus on the restrictions put upon women so they fit into societal norms of the time. And many of the issues that restricted women during the 19th century still affect us today. And I think we need to understand our history to know what women went through to give us our rights, especially now. In the United States, where states have begun to strip away at Roe versus Wade and taken over controls of our own bodies.
谢谢莱斯利的精彩分享。接下来呢，我有一个问题想再问一下那个 Michael。从刚才的那个展示中呢，我们可以看到，莱斯利的作品呢，已经和传统意义的那个摄影作品不一样了。他甚至呢，已经脱离了相机的使用，他使用扫描和后期处理来创造关于这些女性生活的叙述。我觉得他的作品更恰当的应该描述为数码拼贴画。您作为英国皇家摄影学会的前理事长和项目总监，能否从英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展组委会的角度给我们解析，通过这种突破常规、有些另类和极具个性作品的入围，是否要传递给外界一个什么样的一个信息？
Yeah, I think for the IPE, I mean, Leslie's work, it brings quite a lot to it in the sense that the IP is about photography rather than photographers. And from that perspective, her work is very much rooted in photography. And I was one of the selectors when I saw this for this edition of the IPE. And for me, I think any competition or exhibition, individual selectors will always have their own particular preferences or experiences that they will bring, even though they're part of a bigger panel of selectors. And for me, I'm always drawn, I suppose, to some of the historical ways of using photography and making photographic history relevant to the 21st century. So Leslie's work is very much rooted within photography, and as an artist herself and photographer also, she adds, as she said, another layer to that through bringing in other elements from illustrated materials, and then the thinking, the thought behind the use of Western symbolism and iconography to enhance the basis of that photographic tintype. So though she's using someone else's photography, she's adding, a very important layer on top of that. And like much of the photography within the IPE, it's telling a much bigger story, as we heard earlier with RJ and his work. It's basically talking about female identity, gender, the relationship of women in the 19th century, but actually that still resonates today. In fact, probably all parts of the world. So it still has a relevancy today. So she's added something much bigger to the photographic basis that it makes it fit the IPE perfectly. And then just finally, they're just incredibly beautiful objects as well in their own right. The PowerPoint presentation, the screen pictures don't really do them full justice when you see them in person. I mean, they are incredibly beautiful, with that photographic basis, and then these other layers on top. They're wonderful objects, and they appeal to all of the selectors, not just me as a photo historian, but all of the selectors really appreciated them both as objects and for that bigger story, that bigger meaning that they're trying to impart.
谢谢Michael 分享。从他刚才的那个总结里面呢，我们可以了解到一个信息，那就是作品要有独特的一个创意。Leslie 的他的作品的胜在他用历史的照片这个基础上加入现代他的思想，然后把它讲述的是当代女性的一个故事。这也让我想到了英国皇家摄影学会，它是世界上最古老的摄影机构之一。英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展也是历史上历史悠久的一个国际的一个摄影大展。但是呢，学会和大展的理念和步伐都是走在世界摄影的一个前列。
It does, and I think in some ways it's work like Leslie's, in this context that still makes it relevant, because actually in some ways it's blurring the boundaries between what photography is and what contemporary art is, and that the work I think makes that transition very effectively, and still helps keep the IPE relevant and has a contemporary relevance. And for me, that's one of the strengths of the IPE, that it can change and evolve over the last 163-4 editions.
对，我觉得 Michael 说的也正是我想的，我觉得咱们想到一起。下面呢，我们将要请出第3位艺术家，也是今晚最年轻的，来自英国的摄影艺术家 Owen Harvey。他的作品《离地间隙》呢，在160届英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展中获得30岁以下青年组的金牌。欧文深入探索世界各地的亚文化，专注于群体身份、男性气质和风格。他的作品在伦敦国家肖像画廊、摄影师画廊和维多利亚和阿尔伯特等画廊展出。哈维呢还为一系列的全球品牌制作商业作品。下面我们先来看一下欧文的这组作品。 刚才的视频呢，我们简单了解到 Owen 的作品风格，并且呢，对这组作品的背景资料有了一个基本的概念。下面呢，我们就来听听 Owen 如何进行这组作品的创作的。Owen，听说你以前是学音乐的，那么你是怎么样进入摄影行业的？
Ni hao. Firstly, I would just like to say thank you for inviting me to talk today. Great. So it's hard to tell my story in photography without starting. I have put together a quick presentation just to show essentially the role of what music played in my career as a photographer. So I will share my screen now. Hard to tell my story in photography without starting from the very beginning, really, which is to talk about my dad and his influence on my sort of career. So this is him at a football match in the 1960s. And football in the UK is so intertwined with style and subculture and music, and all of these things were influencing each other very much in that period of time. Alongside football, he was influenced hugely by music and would show me lots of bands when I was a young teenager and a young child. One of the first records that I was introduced to was Quadrophenia by a band called The Who. Not only was the music very attractive to me, but it was the first time that I'd ever looked at a picture story or a sequence of images without really realizing what I was looking at. At this time, I had no real knowledge of photography before this. And these pictures were taken by a photographer called Ethan Russell. At the time, I had no idea who he was. But these pictures resonated with me a lot because at the time I was probably just coming into my teenage years. I was working as a kitchen porter, so someone who was just cleaning dishes. And within these pictures, I saw a lot of myself in these pictures at that time. They were essentially pictures about teenage angst, frustration, and sort of, in some ways, desperation, really. As I said, at the time, I was not really, I didn't really understand what I was looking at. I just understood that the pictures resonated with me. But my main focus of that period was music, and I was playing guitar fanatically for 6+ hours a day. This led to me playing music in a band for many years. This is me on stage in 2009 when I was much more agile and had a lot more life in me. One thing that I really learned from those photographs of Ethan Russell is that I was very much interested in pictures that told stories, that were all about storytelling. So through Ethan Russell was my first accidental introduction to photography, and my second introduction was photographers who were often at our shows when we were playing concerts. My dad, as I explained, was very much involved in football culture. And also in the period he grew up in, there was many subcultures in the UK. One of these subcultures that he was very much part of was were the mods, or it's called mod subculture, short for modernism. This was a collective group of people who all came together in a group who were influenced by sort of late 1950s jazz music style of often going to tailors, but saving all of their money to buy tailored clothes to look $1 million on the weekend, even though their lifestyle may not reflect this in reality. So these were the first pictures that I made, and these were all about that subculture of mod, and it was very much a project that I focused on because of the influence of my own father. I wanted these images to feel timeless because originally this subculture had started in the late 1950s, and although I was taking these pictures in the present day, I wanted them to have a quality to them where you didn't really understand what period they were made in. Moving on from this project, as I just wanted to give a quick overview, this was how the work was shown at my first exhibition. And then I went on to make work that was about another subculture that was about skinheads in the UK, a complex subculture that has both influences from the far right and also left-wing politics, and is very multi-layered. I could talk about this for hours, so I won't. I'll keep it as short as that. And then one thing that I was told that really resonated with me, especially after seeing the Ethan Russell pictures, someone said to me, the best type of pictures are a reflection of the photographer. So far in my career, if you could call it that at this point, I had really made pictures that were influenced by what I'd grown up around. And then I got to a period of time where I wanted to photograph something that was more directly about my upbringing. I grew up a lot listening to hip hop music, especially sort of American influenced hip hop music, being in the UK. And I decided that I wanted to go over there to photograph the scenes that were really influenced by that. So in 2016 to 2017, I flew over to Manhattan on the east side. I'd never actually been to America at this point, and stayed within Manhattan and the Bronx and photographing lowriding, which is a subculture influenced by Mexican American youth and politics, and very much part of the nature of hip hop. And all of these projects that I was doing felt like they were all coming under the same umbrella of work. So even though they were all separate projects, from mods to skinheads to lowriding, they all kind of came under one umbrella. The way I work is, I guess I'm very much an outsider of most things I photograph, although I very much see part of myself in a lot of the people I photograph, whether that be a need for belonging or a slight aspect of bravado like most people have at times, or various different aspects for the different people I've hung around with.
一般你是怎么样来找你的一个拍摄对象？就是你说刚才你说在他们身上找到你的影子，所以你在选择这些拍摄对象的时候，自己会有一种什么样的感觉，然后让你去拍它
？So as I explained, the mod series was a direct influence from my father and the music he'd introduced to me. So then I would go out after much research and find appropriate people to photograph who are very much living that lifestyle. Okay. And for example, sorry, I'll let you go. And for example, this series that we're going to talk about, I guess a little more in depth today, was very much about my own upbringing and how I sort of was influenced by American hip hop music. And very often I would see lowriders referenced in music videos and the culture around that. So it was very much about almost wanting to have a sort of childlike exploration to go and see for myself what it was all about. And once I had made connection with a group of people, I would often spend many months with them photographing them. So this is obviously quite a small selection of a larger body of work.
那你能否结合这些作品来聊一下这些作品背后的那个故事？
Yes, so 4 of these images were included as part of the IP's 160th exhibition, I believe is the correct one. And they won the Under 30s Gold Award, which was brilliant. A big sort of boost for me, and lovely to have some recognition for the work that I've been working on for, I guess by that point, over a period of not this specific project, but I see it all as one project, which was be 10 years. And to tell, I guess, a specific story about this, the way it unfolded is I had reached out to this group of individuals that were living in New York. I had sent them the previous work that I had made, or some of the previous work that I've shown you guys today. I explained that the way that I see my work is very much celebratory. I often describe it as sort of celebratory documentary photography. And I asked if I could come over and stay with them for a period of time to make these pictures and to get a better understanding of how this subculture is such a huge part of their lives. Originally, I sent an email that said, could I come over and photograph? I got a one-word answer that said sure with a phone number, and that was all I got. And I thought that was enough to jump on a plane and go over to New York. When I got there, for the first week I heard nothing, and then I was allowed to meet a group of these people who are involved in the scene, and from there it took a period of time to really get to know the people I was photographing and spend time with them to try and take pictures that I felt were successful. The pictures really became successful to me later within my trip there. Much like, sorry, go on, I'll go, let you go from there. Much like the first pictures I showed you, the mod pictures that had a timeless quality to them and played with this idea of time. I wanted these images to play with this idea of cinema and music videos and these things where I had first been educated about the subculture and real life. So they were sort of playing with reality and fiction. Within all of the work that I make, I guess I'm interested about how people play roles or characters in their everyday life. And I think we all do this to some extent. And that's why I always want the images to have this sort of juxtaposition between everyday people, which they are, and then this sort of perceived notion they have of themselves. And these pictures became more successful to me when I started using more direct references from cinema, from music videos, as I said, and where I allowed people to put themselves in poses as they wished to present themselves in a way that they wanted others to see them, which I believe in a strange way actually allows the viewer to get a sense of more of a sense of what is going on in the person's mind that I'm photographing than if I was to construct an image completely, and it was more collaborative than that, really. I'm aware that we have looked at a lot of pictures today, so I'm not going to talk any longer or show any more pictures.
那这边呢，我想还有一个问题想再问你一下呢，你的这组作品呢，在英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展中，你是获得了一个30岁以下的一个青年摄影师的金奖。那这个奖项对于你的创作生涯有没有产生什么样的一个影响
？Yeah, it's always hard to outline exactly what something has, but I believe that, of course, it's always good to get the work in front of a new audience, and the RPS exhibition really allowed that to happen. The other part of that, of course, is there was some part of the award was some money, and this allowed me to continue making the work.
谢谢欧文，也再次祝贺你在这个赛事中获得了一个金奖。然后 Michael 呢，我想再问一下，就是英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展呢，它在每年都会设置专门针对30岁以下的青年人的这样的一个奖项，能否告诉我们这个奖项设置目的和意义所在
？Yes, it's something that has been going on for quite a few years, certainly longer than me being at the RPS. But I think the RPS has always been keen to encourage new photographers, new talent coming through, and it's one way of doing that by having a category for under 30s. We also give awards or bursaries to young photographers as well to help them realize new bodies of work. So we're always keen to support young photographers.
从刚才3位艺术家刚才展示的作品来看呢，我们看到了3组不管是从内容还是创作风格或者是艺术表现手法都截然不同的一个作品。在这里呢，我们看到了英国皇家摄影学会对摄影的最好诠释、开放、包容和发展。所以 Michael 呢，我想下面还有一个问题，你能否和我们聊聊随着摄影的发展，英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展征集的作品特点发生了什么样的一个变化
？We have seen changes, and well, I suppose in the very short term, I mean, last year we saw a lot of lockdown COVID projects, which perhaps is inevitable. So photography often reflects what's happening immediately in the world around us. But in the slightly longer term, for me, I think one of the trends that I've noticed, especially is the growth in photographers producing whole bodies of work, and what we would call in terms of the entries for the IPE series work, and entering more a series of photographs rather than just a single image. And I think that's partly because photographers and artists are often exploring particular areas in greater depth, perhaps, than or they're using the bodies of work to allow them to do that. And I think, to me, that's added a new dimension to the IPE, because it allows us to show more than just one work from a particular photographer, from a series of body of work that they're producing, and actually allow us to show more in-depth work and exploration of some of the subjects they're dealing with. And then the sort of final comment, I suppose, is that I think we've seen a decline in perhaps what might be called traditional, say, landscape or natural history photography being entered and selected for the IPE. And I think, again, there's two reasons for that. Partly the types of selectors that we choose now for the exhibition are perhaps more reflecting contemporary photography, but also I think photographers are exploring landscape, but using to talk about bigger issues around the environment, rather than just producing beautiful landscape pictures. We occasionally get some of those, but they're using landscape to draw out bigger themes. Likewise with portraiture, that the portraits we get very, very much reflecting the individual in a different way than they might have done traditionally. And the same apply, in the same way as portraiture, the same applies to, perhaps more traditional natural history photography, wildlife photography, where, people they're still photographing animals and plants, but again, they're approaching those subjects in less traditional ways to use them to document and to record changes within the environment, or the impact, say, of man on animals and flora. So again, I think it's a different approach, in part again reflecting the more contemporary nature of both the RPS, but also the selectors who are choosing the pictures for the exhibition.
那么对于在英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展获奖或者入围的这个作品 ，RPS 会对这些作品进行什么样的宣传和推荐？比如进行展览或推荐给画廊，进行市场销售运作。尤其呢，我们比较感兴趣的是，近年来 RPS 对于摄影作品的市场化操作有没有什么突破性的做法？
Yeah. I would hesitate to say we've made any breakthroughs, but we do support the photographers, as I suggested in my presentation. So we will get approaches from agencies, for example, and make introductions between the photographer and agencies. And the exhibition itself is a great showcase for contemporary photography, so it gets visited by certainly with particularly UK art directors and people based within the UK, and then obviously social media has transformed the way that we market and promote the IPE and the work selected within them. We're hoping to introduce a slightly more formal way of introducing print sales into the exhibition to help support photographers, and during the COVID period in the UK, we're very keen to make sure that photographers got recognition at a time when so many of them were freelancers and their income had gone down. So we tried to support them as best we could through that period, but there's certainly more that we're looking to do, and I think the IPE lends itself to that very well.
那么你作为RPS 长期的一个管理者，也作为多届 RPS 国际摄影展的评委，对于打算参加这个大展的影友想取得好成绩，你有什么建议吗？
I think I hope I've said that during my presentation. Really produce something that's distinctive, and I think the work that we've seen today from the three artists here has been very distinctive in very different ways. And I think there's no one approach. It's about making your own photography distinctive and special, and perhaps focusing on subjects, particularly from local subjects to you in China, that we will be of particular interest to us in the West, I think. And then the other thing I would say is join the RPS as well. We'd love to have you on board.
那么阿俊，你作为连续2届的作品获奖和入围者，对于这个问题，你有什么样的建议给到影友呢？
I would say create work that speaks to your heart. Don't rush to share a project that isn't fully articulated and realized. I think that's what I would suggest.
那莱斯利，以你参加这个大展的经验，你有什么话想对屏幕前的影友说吗？
I agree with RJ, wait until you're ready to show it, but definitely take a chance and apply, because you never know. And it's such a good opportunity to have people to see your work that may never have seen it before, which includes art lovers and gallerists and art directors and publishers. So it's definitely go for it.
Okay.
那 Owen， 你作为这个金奖得主，你有什么建议给到影友吗？
I would just say the thing that I've always thought is most important is about authenticity. So if the work is authentic, I believe it will speak to other people, and I think just make work that you think needs to be made, really needs to be out there, and why not give it a go? Send it to some people and see what the reaction is.
下面呢还有几个问题是那个听讲的那个影友发来的，这个问题他是问 Michael 的，这个问题是这样的：如果 RJ 的作品没有文字说明，人们可以看懂照片的含义吗？怎么样来理解照片是视觉艺术，无需语言？作为镜像的照片，为什么要去做更擅长讲故事的视频功能？
It's a good question, and I think sometimes the photograph doesn't need text because it encapsulates what it's trying to say within the picture. But I think often, and I think we've seen increasingly, that the combination of a series of works and some supporting text actually make something much bigger than if they'd been separate. So I personally, I always enjoy and find I get a lot from reading additional text that supports the photography, because it helps me understand what the photographer's intention is and what they're trying to say through their photography, and that sometimes isn't always apparent through the pictures. We have some work in the current exhibition where incredibly powerful pictures, but the text tells me a lot more of the meaning behind them, and there's some quite heavy, quite dark meanings behind some of that work, and the text helps me understand that. And I would also just add that because we're showing the work of, say in the current IPE, we're showing the work of 57 photographers. So they're quite distinct pieces of work that in that context, I think the text becomes a bit more important. If it were a single photographer, single artist show, you would often have an introductory panel that would introduce the work, and you wouldn't necessarily then need detailed explanations under each picture. But because of the nature of this exhibition, I think the text becomes quite a bit more important than it might be in a different context.
然后这是网友天谷，他是请教 Owen 的，请教一下文化语境的不同，图片解读上的隔阂如何得到有效缓解？
Well, often the images have a synopsis with them, so some text that if they were to be exhibited in another country, that would be translated so they could read about the work. And I would imagine that most people, if they're interested then in the work, would go on to maybe do more research about that subculture or what it is I'm photographing, and I want that to be part of the process as well. And just to add to that, as I said, I mainly see myself sort of my main interest is storytelling. So on my website, I make sure that there's text about each project. Quite often photographers will show work without the text, and much like Michael, I quite like to read about the work. So on my website there is text about it, and of course, hopefully then people can translate that and read about the work there too.
然后这个问题是网友小米巡游，他问的是莱斯利老师，这系列作品非常具有个性，那用传统的拍摄方式是否可以拍摄出另类的作品呢？能说明下相机拍摄和这类后期扫描的作品有什么不一样的地方呢？
The difference between well, it's funny because once I work with these tintypes so much, I almost feel like they are my pictures. I feel like when I started my series working with tintypes at the beginning, I was going through a really difficult period in my life, and as I worked with these images, originally the images had no faces on them. I had blacked out the faces. And then I started just blacking out half of the faces. And then I realized that this blackout of half of the faces should have been a male portrait. And I started making male silhouettes across women's faces. And as I started like exploring what I was feeling, I realized that a lot of these women were me, basically. And I sort of learned through them, and I felt like they have become my images.
那个网友黑泽敏他问的是 RG 在拍摄这种长期的摄影题材，是否拍摄的构思在拍摄中期会有一种转变？
So in the first time I photographed my subjects, I asked them all one question. I asked them, show me what next year's grand champion would be. So it plants this seed of hope for the future. The concept then changed 4 years later when I asked them, show me your best self, in the sense that self-esteem and confidence was more at the forefront of the conversation and the visuals, and that they got to choose what they chose to wear, where did we photograph, and they were as much of a participant as they were a subject, which the first time around, they were much more of a subject because we had just met and didn't know each other as well. So those would be the two differences.
这边最后一个问题，他是问我自己的，就是晚上听了这边的一个对话，3个Michael 的一个介绍，还有3位艺术家的对话呢，他是说对于参加这个大赛比较感兴趣，是想怎么样来参加这个摄影展，所以呢，我这边呢，因为时间关系，我就给大家放一个我们的一个联系方式，你只要把作品发过来，到时候。
upload there.
对，然后就是说，大家如果说有兴趣的话，就把这个记一下，然后回头具体跟这里面联系，到时候怎么样来参加？因为我们这边可以提供帮大家一起选片，然后一起来参赛各种方式。所以晚上时间关系我就不多说了。下面呢，就是说今天晚上我觉得时间已经远远超过了原来的一个预想，大家都聊得很多很尽兴，所以在今天晚上的那个访谈中呢，3位艺术家的作品，它虽然呢风格迥异，但有一点呢它是共同的，那就是都有自己独特的视角和思想。和他们的对话呢，我们开阔了思路，同时也让我们有一个更好的一个思考，如何将我们的镜头对准身边的这个文化，如何根据视觉的线索看待社会及事物，以及如何用独特的视觉语言创作出属于我们自己的一个图像作品。而 Michael 呢，他的精辟的点评解析，以及对英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展的一个详尽的一个介绍，也让我们对于这个历史悠久的大展有了进一步的一个认识。对于想要参加这个大展的中国影友呢，将会有很大的一个帮助。在此呢，期待我们在今年的英国皇家摄影学会国际摄影展中，能够有中国摄影师的作品崭露头角。 再次感谢 Michael， 感谢阿卷、莱斯利和欧文3位艺术家，也谢谢参与我们直播的各位观众朋友。谢谢我身边的翻译 Jenny， 还有上图坊的其他工作人员，谢谢你们的辛勤付出。今天的直播到此结束，欢迎大家继续关注上图坊创谈会云聊吧，我们下期再见。